The frost on the arena rails was thick enough to hold a fingerprint for 11 days, and Yurina Volkova had counted every one of them from the servants' gate, before anyone thought to ask why an exiled huntress was standing inside the walls of Belogary at all. 3 ribs cracked, 1 Wolfsar's dagger sewn into her boot lining, and a wedding invitation in her fist that was never meant to bring her back alive. If you're watching this from somewhere cold enough tonight to see your own breath, tell me in the comments. And if you've ever been handed an invitation that was really a blade, hit like before the first loop closes, because this one doesn't forgive anyone who looks away. 7 years earlier, the Chornalik line had been struck from every genealogical scroll in the northern Pax, its wolves banned from the sacred hunting grounds, its name spoken only as a warning to disobedient pups. Yurina had been 12 when the elders burned the family seal in the square, and she remembered exactly how the smoke had smelled. Pine resin, and something under it, something that was not pine at all, something that was her grandmother's prayer beads melting in the same fire. She remembered her mother's hand clamped over her mouth, so she would not scream the truth that everyone already suspected, and no one would say aloud, the Chornalik line had not betrayed the throne. Someone inside the throne had betrayed the Chornalik line, and then made sure the wolves who could prove it were never permitted to speak again. That was Loop A, and it would not close for a very long time. She had trained in exile the way only the truly abandoned train, without mercy, without witnesses, without the luxury of believing anyone would come to save her if she failed. The southern marshlands had taught her to move without leaving scent, to read a blade wound by its color, and know within a heartbeat whether the steel had been dipped in silver, wolfsbane, or plain iron, meant only to bleed. She had traded her name for a decade of survival, taking work no pack-bound wolf would touch, tracking rogue biters through the black pine forests, setting broken bones for smugglers who paid in coin instead of questions, learning enough of poison and its cures that healers 3 provinces away began quietly sending for the northern woman when their own remedies failed. It was this reputation, and not her blood, that brought her within a mile of the ambush site on the night everything changed. The messenger had said only that a nobleman lay dying somewhere in the ravine below the old signal towers, that the local healer had already tried and fled, that whoever went in should not expect thanks and should absolutely not expect payment before the man either lived or didn't. Yurina had gone anyway, because 11 years of exile teaches you that idle curiosity is a luxury and unclaimed coin is not, and because some small traitorous part of her still wanted to prove, to no one in particular, that a Chornalik wolf could save a life the whole kingdom had already given up on. She found him half buried under a collapsed shelf of frozen shale, one arm bent at an angle, that told her everything about how far he had fallen and how hard he had tried, in his last conscious moments, not to fall onto the parts of himself that mattered for survival. His hair was black going to iron at the temples, even though his face, when she finally cleared the rubble from it, could not have belonged to a man older than 32. There was a wound along his ribs that had not come from the fall, a clean puncture, deliberate, the kind of wound a trained hand leaves when it wants a death to look accidental. And beneath the blood and the shale dust, stitched into the collar of a coat too fine for any ordinary traveler in this ravine, she found 6 wolfsars embroidered in silver thread, biting their own tails in an unbroken circle, the royal seal of Belogary, the mark of the Ashen Sovereign's own house. She should have left him. Every practical instinct she had cultivated in exile screamed at her to leave him, because a dead nobleman found by a Chornalik exile was a hanging offense, and a living one, once healed, might simply decide her survival was less convenient than her silence. But his pulse was a thin, stubborn thread under her fingers, and something in the set of his jaw, even unconscious, even broken, refused to look like a man who had given up, and 11 years of exile had apparently not managed to burn every foolish instinct out of her after all. She did not know, as she packed the wound with moss and pressed her whole weight against the bleeding, that the man breathing raggedly under her hands was Ruslan Dracomir, called by his own court the Wolf Tsar of Belogary, and that 3 men from his own council had pushed him from the ridge above 4 hours earlier, believing the fall alone would kill him quietly enough that no one would ever have to explain a knife wound on a sovereign's body. That was Loop B, though neither of them knew it yet. The ambush was not an accident. and the men who arranged it were not finished. She built a fire he could not smell, in a hollow the wind could not reach, and for 2 days she fed him broth boiled from bark, and her own stubborn refusal to let a stranger die for the crime of being interesting. He woke on the 3rd day with a wolf's golden eyes gone the color of a storm. She would learn later that his eyes changed with his temper, gold when calm, near black when the beast under his skin pressed close to the surface. And the first thing he said, voice wrecked from disuse, was not a question about his wounds or his rescuer's name. "You should have let me die out here." It would have been simpler for everyone. "Simpler isn't the same as right," she said, and did not tell him her name, and he did not ask again, not for 3 more days, during which he mended faster than any ordinary wolf had a right to, and watched her with an attention that made the frost-bitten ravine feel, absurdly, warmer than it should have. He told her his name was Ruslan. He did not tell her the rest of it, because a man who has just discovered his own counsel wants him dead, learns quickly that anonymity is the only armor left to him, and he had begun, against every instinct he possessed, to want this woman to look at him the way she was looking at him now, as a person worth saving, not a crown worth protecting. She did not tell him her name was Volkova, because a woman exiled for a crime she did not commit learns just as quickly that names are weapons other people use against you, and she had begun, against every instinct she possessed, to want this man to keep looking at her exactly like that, for as long as the world would allow it. They had 11 days together in that hollow, before his strength returned enough to travel, and Urina would later think of those 11 days the way other people think of entire lifetimes, compressed, absurd, unbearably clear in memory. He learned to whittle again with his ruined hand, cursing softly at his own clumsiness. She learned that his laugh, when it finally came, on the 7th night, over a badly told joke about a one-eyed goat, sounded like something that had not been allowed to exist in a very long time, and did not quite know how to behave now that it had permission. On the 9th night, a storm rolled down off the northern ridges hard enough to collapse half their windbreak of pine boughs, and Urina spent 3 hours rebuilding it, while Ruslan, still too weak to lift more than a single branch at a time, sat wrapped in the one remaining blanket and directed her with the particular useless authority of a man who has clearly never built a windbreak in his life, but refuses to admit it. "The angle's wrong," he said, for the 4th time, and she finally turned and threw a fistful of snow directly into his face, and the sound he made afterward, somewhere between outrage and genuine startled laughter, was the first sound she'd heard from him that didn't carry the weight of a crown he hadn't yet told her he wore. By the 10th day, his fever had broken entirely, and he insisted, against her explicit instructions, on standing long enough to help her skin the rabbit she'd trapped, his ruined hand fumbling the small knife twice, before she took it back without a word, and finished the work herself, while he watched her fingers move, with an attention that had nothing to do with the rabbit at all. "You do everything like it's the only thing keeping you alive," he said quietly, and she did not answer, because it was true, and because 11 years of exile had never once given her the luxury of doing anything any other way. "It doesn't have to be the only thing anymore," he added, and the silence that followed sat between them for a long time, comfortable in a way neither of them examined too closely, the fire cracking low and orange against the dark, snow ticking softly against the leather stretched over their shelter, his shoulder close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth radiating off the fever, finally breaking beneath his skin. On the 12th morning, 3 of his household guard finally found the ravine, and Urina watched every one of them drop to one knee in the snow, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a woman who has spent 11 years learning never to be surprised, exactly who she had been feeding broth to for a week and a half. "Sovereign," the guard captain said, and Ruslan's jaw tightened in a way that told her he had known this moment was coming, and had spent 11 days dreading it anyway. "You could have told me," she said quietly, already stepping back toward the tree line, already rebuilding the walls 11 years of survival had taught her never to fully lower. "Would you have stayed if I had?" She did not answer, because they both already knew, and because the guard captain was watching them with an expression that suggested loyalty came with sharper edges than either of them had accounted for. Ruslan Dracomir did not let her simply walk back into exile. He named her, before his own household, the woman who had found the wolf Tsar half dead in a ravine and refused to leave him there, and he did not ask, before doing it, whether she wanted that particular kind of attention pointed at a woman with a prescribed name. It was the first mistake he made, and it would not be the last, but it came from a place no one had offered her kindness from in 11 years, and some part of her, however wary, could not entirely resent him for it. It took 4 days for someone in the household to recognize the shape of her face against an old portrait no one had burned quite thoroughly enough, and by the 5th day, the name Chornalik moved through Belagoria's stone halls, like smoke finding every crack in a shuttered room. She expected to be thrown out. She expected chains, or worse. What she had not expected, what almost undid the careful composure 11 years had built into her, more than any threat could have, was Ruslan, standing in the great hall in front of his full council, the same council that 4 days ago had watched 3 of its members carried off in irons for the ambush in the ravine, and saying, in a voice that did not shake even slightly, "The woman who saved my life will not be exiled from this house while I am breathing." That was the moment his eyes went, for the first time in front of witnesses, from storm gray back to gold. Not calm gold, but something fiercer underneath it. A gold that made 3 separate council members look down at their own boots, rather than meet it. Devotion, she would learn, looked different on an Alpha King than it did in the old stories. It did not look soft. It looked like a man daring an entire room to disagree with him, and quietly hoping someone would, so he'd have an excuse to prove exactly how far he'd go. She should have felt safe. Instead, she felt the second open loop tighten around her throat. Because safety inside Belagori's walls had never once, in the entire bloody history of the Chornalik name, meant what it appeared to mean. Word of the exiled huntress living under royal protection reached the Western territories within a fortnight, and it reached, specifically, the ears of a wolf named Bogdan Severa, the man Yarina had been promised to before the burning of the seal, the man who had stood beside the fire and said nothing while her family's name turned to ash, the man who had married, 4 years later, into a house wealthy enough to make certain no one ever asked what he'd been willing to sacrifice for the alliance. Bogdan's new mate, Ksenia, was cruel in the particular, practiced way of women who have spent their entire lives being told cruelty and cleverness were the same skill. When she learned that the disgraced Chornalik girl was not only alive but standing in the Wolf Tsar's own hall, she did not waste time on outrage. She sent, instead, an invitation, gilded, perfumed, addressed with excruciating correctness to Lady Yarina, formerly of the proscribed house, inviting her to the mating ceremony that would formally bind Bogdan Severa to Ksenia before the full assembly of 6-packs in 3 weeks' time at the great arena of Belagoria itself. Everyone who received a copy of that invitation understood exactly what it was. It was not a courtesy. It was a summons designed to place the exile in the center of a public stage, surrounded by every wolf who remembered her family's disgrace, forced to watch the man who had abandoned her bind himself to another woman in front of the entire assembled kingdom, and to do it with a smile, because refusing the invitation would be read as cowardice, and accepting it would be read as humiliation either way. "Don't go," Ruslan said, when she showed him the parchment, his knuckles white around the edge of the council table. "You owe that house nothing, least of all a performance. If I don't go, Bogdan tells this entire kingdom I was too broken to face him," she said. "If I go and say nothing, he tells them I've accepted my place at the bottom of it. There's a third option, but it requires you to trust me with something you haven't been willing to trust anyone with yet." That was the moment the third loop opened, the one that would not close until the arena itself. What Ruslan had not told her, in 11 days in that ravine, or in the weeks since, was the reason 3 of his own councilmen had pushed him from that ridge in the first place. The Severa house, Bogdan's new family by marriage, held a controlling claim to the border trade routes only as long as no rival bloodline could prove an older, unbroken right to them. A right that had, until 7 years ago, belonged entirely to the Chornalik line, and had been quietly absorbed into Severa holdings the same season Yarina's family was burned out of the record books. The proscription of House Chornalik had never been about betrayal at all. It had been about trade routes, and about a document buried in the Severa family archive that, if it ever surfaced, would collapse Bogdan's entire inherited fortune and expose the councilman who'd helped bury the truth in exchange for a cut of the profits. Ruslan had learned this only 9 days ago, from the confession of the surviving conspirator dragged from the ravine ambush in Irons, the same conspirator who had admitted, under considerably less gentle questioning than Urina's broth and moss, that the plan had never simply been to kill the Wolf Tsar. It had been to kill him quietly enough that his death could be blamed on the Chornolik exile everyone already assumed was still lurking, embittered, somewhere in the southern marshlands. 2 crimes solved with 1 convenient corpse, and a trade route secured for another generation. Ruslan had been carrying this knowledge for 9 days without telling her, terrified that the truth, that her family's ruin had been engineered specifically to enrich the man who'd abandoned her, would break something in her that 11 years of exile hadn't managed to break, and that watching it break would cost him something he wasn't ready to survive losing. "You should have told me," she said again, and this time her voice did shake, just slightly, before she steadied it. "Every day you didn't tell me. You let me believe my family's name was Ash, for a crime we actually committed. Do you understand what that did to me, carrying that shame for 11 years, when the truth was sitting in a ledger in your own archive the whole time?" "I'm telling you now," he said, "before the ceremony, before it's too late to use it." She forgave him, not because the delay didn't matter, but because she recognized, in his terror of hurting her further, the same instinct that had kept her silent about her own name in that ravine for 11 days, the particular cowardice of people who have finally found something worth protecting and don't yet trust themselves not to ruin it. There was, tucked into the confession alongside the truth about the trade routes, one more detail that changed everything Urina thought she knew about her own bloodline. The original Chornolik seal, the one burned in the square when she was 12, had been a forgery, a decoy, left behind, specifically so the real seal, and the document proving unbroken succession rights, would survive the purge. Her grandmother had known. Her grandmother had sewn the true seal, disguised as an ordinary hunting dagger, with a bone handle worn smooth by 3 generations of hands, into the lining of a traveling coat before the fires ever started. The same coat that had passed, quietly, unremarked, from mother to daughter, until it hung now, patched and travel-worn, in Urina's own small room, in the servants' wing of Belogari's great hall. Urina had worn that coat for 11 years without once suspecting what its lining held. When she finally cut the stitches open with trembling hands on the night before the ceremony, the dagger that fell into her palm bore, along the blade's spine, 6 wolf tsars biting their own tails, the exact seal stitched into the collar of the coat she'd found Ruslan buried under, the exact seal that marked unbroken succession rights to the Chornolik trade routes, the exact proof that could, presented before the full assembly of 6-packs, unmake Bogdan Severa's entire inherited fortune in a single public breath. "This is what my grandmother died protecting," she said, turning the blade under candlelight, watching the old silver catch and hold it. Not a betrayal, a truth someone was willing to burn a family alive to keep buried. "Then we don't hide it at the ceremony," Ruslan said. "We use it exactly the way she meant it to be used." The arena of Belogare had stood for 4 centuries, its stone tiers worn smooth by generations of wolves gathering to witness matings, successions, and the rare, brutal ritual duels that settled disputes no council could resolve with words alone. On the morning of Bogdan Severa's mating ceremony, every tier was full. 6-packs worth of wolves crowded shoulder to shoulder in the frost-bright air, breath rising in a collective fog above the packed stone, the low murmur of 6 kingdoms' worth of gossip, already circling the one topic everyone had come to watch, whether the disgraced Chornolik exile would actually dare to show her face. She wore no gilded gown to match the occasion. She wore the same patched traveling coat, the bone-handled dagger visible now at her hip rather than hidden in a lining, and she walked into the arena on her own feet, unescorted, while Ksenia Severa's carefully composed smile flickered, just once, at the sight of her. Bogdan, standing at the ceremonial dais beside his bride-to-be, made the mistake that would echo through every retelling of this day, for years afterward. He smiled at Urina's arrival with exactly the cruelty he'd once shown while staying silent as her family burned, and said, loud enough for the nearest tears to hear, I wondered if the Chornalic stray would crawl out of whatever hole she'd found to hide in. The old Yarina, the 12-year-old who'd stood in the square with her mother's hand over her mouth, might have flinched. The woman who had spent 11 years learning to read a poisoned wound by color alone did not flinch at all. I found a considerably better hole than the one your family dug for mine, Bogdan, though I understand you're about to marry into a house that specializes in digging. The crowd's murmur sharpened into something else entirely. Attention, the particular electric attention of six-packs realizing, all at once, that they had come for a mating ceremony and were about to witness something else. Ksenia recovered first, her voice pitched to Carrie. Careful, little exile. Ritual arenas have rules about who's permitted to speak uninvited. She has more right to speak in this arena than either of you, Ruslan said, stepping forward from the sovereign's dais, and the entire arena went silent in the particular way. 6,000 wolves go silent when their king's voice carries an edge. None of them have heard from him before. Because what she's about to say concerns a document your family has spent 7 years and 1 attempted assassination trying to make certain no one would ever hear. That was the 4th loop closing, though only Yarina and Ruslan understood, in that moment, that everything before this had been leading here. Bogdan's composure cracked first. This is a mating ceremony, not a council hearing, whatever grievance the exile is nursing. The grievance, Yarina said, drawing the bone-handled dagger and holding it high enough that the winter light caught the silver seal along its spine, belongs to a family your house helped erase, for the crime of owning trade routes your father wanted for himself. This blade carries the true seal of House Chornalic, the seal your family forged a decoy to replace, the seal that proves unbroken succession rights your father has been profiting from for 7 years on the strength of a lie. The arena erupted into a roar that took the ceremonial guards nearly a full minute to quiet, and in that minute, Yarina watched Ksenia's face go the particular gray of a woman calculating, in real time, exactly how much of her new fortune was about to collapse. Ritual law, Ruslan said, once the noise finally dropped enough to be heard, permits any wolf with a disputed claim of succession to invoke a duel of proof before the full assembly, the outcome binding on all 6 packs. I invoke that law now, on Lady Yarina's behalf, and I stand as her second. It was Bogdan's council seat, not Bogdan himself, that answered the challenge. An older cousin, named Marek Volin, the same councilman who had helped bury the original documents 7 years ago, and who had, Ruslan now knew from the Ravine conspirator's confession, been one of the 3 men who pushed him from that ridge. Marek stepped into the ritual circle with the confidence of a man who had never once expected the exile's evidence to survive this long, and considerably less confidence once he registered exactly which blade she was holding. The duel that followed lasted less than 4 minutes, and every wolf in that arena would swear afterward that it felt like considerably longer, because Yarina Volkova fought the way she had learned to survive, without wasted motion, without theater, reading Marek's guard the way she'd once read a poisoned wound, the telltale hesitation in his left shoulder before every feint, the way his boots dragged half an inch too long on the frozen stone whenever he shifted his weight to strike, and ending it with a single controlled strike that left him disarmed and bleeding at her feet rather than dead, because she had decided, somewhere in those 11 days in the ravine, that mercy was a weapon her family's enemies had never once shown her, and she intended to be better than them in every single way that mattered. "Confess it," she said, standing over him, blade steady. "Confess it before 6 packs, or I let the council decide what silence costs. A man caught holding a forged seal in front of the true one." Marek Volin confessed. Everything. The forged decoy seal, the buried succession documents, the trade route theft, the ambush in the ravine arranged with Bogdan's quiet financial backing to eliminate the sovereign who'd begun asking too many questions about the old Chornalic case. Bogdan's face, as the confession unspooled before 6 packs worth of witnesses, went through every stage of a man watching his entire inherited life collapse in real time, and Ksenia, to her credit or her self-preservation, was already several steps away from him by the time the guards moved in, her mating ceremony abandoned, along with any pretense of loyalty to a man about to lose everything. The rival who had mocked her, that same rival's careless words from the arena's opening moment. I wondered if the Chornalik stray would crawl out of whatever hole she'd found to hide in. Hung in the frozen air now as something closer to prophecy than insult, because the woman who'd crawled out of that hole had just unmade his entire fortune with a single blade, and a truth 7 years buried. Merrick Volin was stripped of council standing and exiled to the same southern marshlands Urena had survived for 11 years, a sentence the assembly agreed, with grim satisfaction, felt considerably like justice completing a circle. Bogdan Severa lost his claim to the trade routes within the week, the council formally restoring them, along with the Chornalik name itself, struck back into every genealogical scroll it had been burned out of 7 years before. Ksenia disappeared from the Western Territories entirely, quietly, without ceremony, and no one in Sixpacks particularly troubled themselves to ask exactly where she had gone or why. Ruslan Dracomir declared, before the same full assembly that had just witnessed the duel, that the Wolf Tsar's protection extended now and permanently to House Chornalik, restored to full standing, and that he intended, with the assembly's blessing or without it, to formally court the woman who had saved his life in a ravine and then saved her own family's name in an arena 3 weeks later. Yarina Volkova did not answer him immediately in front of Sixpacks. She answered him that night, in the same small room in the servants' wing, where a bone-handled dagger had waited 11 years inside a coat lining for the moment it was finally needed, telling him that she had spent 11 years learning to survive without anyone's protection and did not intend to trade that hard-won strength for dependence on his, but that she had also spent 11 years without anyone worth trusting enough to stand beside instead of behind, and that he, infuriatingly, inconveniently, had become exactly that. The formal mating ceremony took place at the same arena 4 months later, this time with Urena standing at its center by choice rather than summons, wearing the restored Chornalik seal openly at last. Sixpacks assembled, not to witness her humiliation, but to witness the moment the Wolf Tsar bound himself, before all of them, to a woman who had refused, at every single turn this story offered her, to be anything other than exactly who she already was. If you made it this far, you already know what it costs to survive being erased, and to come back anyway. So tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if this one hit different, you know exactly what to do before the next story starts. Because next week, we're going back into the frost for the tale of the healer the whole kingdom called cursed, and what happened when the Wolf Tsar's own brother discovered exactly why.